All right, so good afternoon, everybody. I know your butts are sore, your brains are full, and most of you are thinking, please hurry up because we want to go to the pub. Totally appreciate that. So let's start our story. Our story tonight begins at a lovely autumn day in New York, or New York City if you're a tourist, or New York if you live there. So at 8:46 a.m. on September 11th, 2001, American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into World Trade Center Tower number 1. About 20 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 crashed into Tower number 2. And right away, there were about 2,606 people killed, over 6,000 people injured. And in terms of the fire service, there were 343 firefighters from the FDNY were also killed that day. Fast forward about half an hour later to Arlington, Virginia, 9:37 a.m. American Airlines Flight 77 hit the west side of the Pentagon. Nice little photo from that here. That one, there were only 185 people killed. There should have been a lot more, but fortunately, there were some renovations going on at that point in time. They were actually reinforcing the structure, making it basically more bomb-proof. And also because you have like very aggressive type A personalities or very disciplined individuals, they managed to evacuate and take care of each other very quickly. And so that actually reduced the casualties at September 11th. So why are we talking about this at a cybersecurity conference? I want to talk a little bit today about the fire service responses in New York and in Washington, D.C. The reason is quite simple. We can learn a lot from the fire service on how to manage cyber incidents in our own industry. But before we go there, as a good speaker, I get to do a little shameless self-promoting. My day job, I'm the CISO for ING. I'm responsible for fraud and cyber at a large global bank. I'm happy to say I'm a CTF winner from DEF CON from a long time ago. But more relevant and more importantly, I used to moonlight as a firefighter in the Northern Virginia area. And our department actually was one of the departments that responded to the Pentagon attack on September 11th. In my fire service, I was known for my work ethic. A very dedicated, hardworking person. Great leadership, training our people all of the time in the station. And of course, at the fire academy, my professionalism was unfounded. You just don't get more professional than that, or just, we worked really hard. That being said, we did do real stuff in the fire service, so it's not just a little bit of show and tell and silliness. We were doing firefighter stuff. The stuff I want to talk about today are largely the conclusions of other people who are actual experts in the field. So did a lot of research and did a lot of reading. So there was thousands of hours of after-action reports and research that went into the fire department responses in the Pentagon and in Washington, and in New York. And in fact, at the Pentagon, the response in Northern Virginia has become a textbook response on what goes well in an incident response. These slides will be available later for those that are actually interested in the sources. And also, I have a little bit of relevant training on incident response and incident management from the fire service perspective. So here's a couple classes I've taken. Some of them are actually a week long, and that's a week long on incident management. It's a week you'll never get back. That said, in my current role as a CISO, it's probably the most relevant training I've had so far. And most of the training, of course, was in the National Incident Management System in the U.S. Bit of a disclaimer, the day started with an American. It's not ending with one. I sound like one, but I'm actually Canadian. So calling me an American is for those of you who are from north of Hadrian's, it's like calling you English. So you can't blame me for Trump. And that's my only political joke for the day. So let's start with FDNY. A little bit of background on the incident itself. September 11th was the largest fire service response in the history of the United States of America. But before we go into a little bit of details, let's set a little bit of groundwork. I'm sure you've heard the phrase single alarm, 5 alarm, 3 alarm, because you've all watched TV with shows that have firefighters. In New York, a single alarm gets you 3 engines, 2 ladder trucks, and a battalion chief, which is the guy in a little fire SUV who kind of tells people and points at things and gets their picture in the paper pointing. Every time. If you want to get your photo in the paper in the fire scene, point at something while leaning on somebody. It's magic. I've even done it. A typical 5 alarm fire in the New York area is 44 units. So for the math nerds in the room, of course, 5 times 6 does not equal 44, but you end up getting additional units in there. You get light and air units, things that provide more lighting on the scene, cylinder changes for your bottles, Just other support units, and often more importantly, a canteen that will typically have stale Snicker bars and watered down coffee, but you're actually always happy to see the canteen as probably your favorite unit on scene. The September 11th response included 214 units. So there was a lot of people who arrived on the scene. So if you can imagine, each engine had 4 people in it, each ladder truck had 5 people, and so forth. You've got, a good couple thousand people there running around doing all sorts of stuff. So can you imagine running and commanding an incident like that? It'd be very complicated and very tricky. When am I supposed to have a slide here? Never mind. I remember what I'm doing now. So some of the issues with New York. I decided to keep with New York. So they had some communication issues. And part of the issues, let me just scroll back ahead to make sure where I am. All right. I should have reviewed a little bit more, and I apologize. So these are the main issues that they had here. There were 6 issues. They had communications. I'll talk more about this. You guys can read all of the slides here. These are, if you think about how many people have been involved in breaches or cyber incidents in their own world. Does this look pretty familiar to you? I think it does. It does to me. So common problems and common things. So let's talk about communications. So for September 11th, there was not a protocol in place, so when units were dispatched, they didn't respond on a radio to say, hey, engine 4 is responding, we're going to this. So there was no confirmation for the dispatchers to know who even actually received the calls and went to the scene. So problem number 1, of course, you don't know who's there, but that ties into accountability. The communications in themselves were a problem. These were old-fashioned radios. They were analog radios. They weren't the 800 and 900 megahertz radios that are in use today with encrypted channels and all sorts of cool stuff with built-in repeaters. These radios were low-range radios that needed portable repeaters. So you had to bring a repeater with you. And fortunately, a lot of those repeaters were set up in the World Trade Center, largely around the command center, which was between towers 1 and 2. So we can see some of the issues where that would have come. Another problem they had is the language they spoke. When the fire service in New York, they used something that's called 10 codes. So instead of saying we have a fire at a single-family home, they would say we have a 1017, which is great if you know what the codes are. But now if you're trying to talk to the police department, the harbor patrol, the FBI, the other units that are on the scene, and you're used to communicating in 10 codes, that's a bit of a problem. We don't speak the same language as everybody else there. And of course, in the security industry, we've never been accused of that ourselves. People understand everything we say in our world, right? So that's one of the other things. The other problem we had is because of communications, the people who were running the incident didn't know really what was going on very well. They were in their command headquarters. The incident command post, as I mentioned, was between towers 1 and 2 as part of the World Trade Center complex. They didn't know what was going on very well because they couldn't hear reports from the people up in the different levels in the building. So a bit of a problem. How do you steer and manage an incident when you don't know what your teams are doing? And you don't know who's where, what's going on, what resources you need. Are you making progress? Are you not making progress? Normally, at a small house fire, you can tell how things are going by watching the smoke. If the smoke turns white, that means the fire is being converted to steam, and you're making progress. If it gets black and thick and becomes more violent, you're losing the battle. It's easy to tell. Here, they didn't have a really good way of knowing. And then, of course, when the towers came down, that complicated things as well. So, we don't need to talk too much about where we went on that. In fact, the communications were so bad that even when the first tower collapsed, which was Tower 2, folks that were in Tower 1 didn't even know about it. And you'd think they would know, right? Because a tower collapsing would be incredibly loud. But fires, believe it or not, are really loud. You've got the fire is a loud thing. And then, of course, you're shouting at each other. You're on your breathing apparatus. You've got adverse conditions. These buildings would have been filled full of smoke because of the fire with the airline fuel. So you've got all those conditions. Communications and situational awareness is also very, very limited. So there are a lot of issues and problems with communications. Now, self-dispatching is another problem. Self-dispatching is when people just show up and it's well-intended, like, I have skills. I'm a firefighter. My gear is in a truck. I'm just going to show up and help. People did that. The other problem that we're going to talk about is recall. And that's the process by which you get other people to show up. So people who are off duty, it's your way. How do you get in? How do you notify them to get them to come to work? Common problems that we have in our incident programs, also in the cyber world. However, self-dispatching wasn't too bad an issue in D.C. It was horrendous in Northern Virginia. We'll talk about that in a second. And only 4 units actually self-dispatched. 2 of them responded, but they got on the radio and said, we're going to this, put us on. And dispatch said, no, you're not. Like, yeah, we are. And so a bit of a back and forth. And so they went. A couple of the other units, people only knew that one of them was there when the engine crew radioed, say, hey, we're on the 36th floor. We've got a few victims. We need help getting them out. And people are like, wait, who are you? Where? What's going on? And that's just not the sort of thing you want. Hi, number 2. Thanks for coming. So the recall procedure was also a bit of a problem because New York, they hadn't tried it in 30 years. So it just didn't work. Nobody knew how to do it. So being creative, and of course it was on the news, they asked the media to help out, and the media actually put a call saying, hey, FDNY personnel, please report to your normal station, your normal duty station. And as a result, thankfully, because it was around shift change, a lot of people were able to get back to their stations, and they were able to fully staff a whole lot of apparatus. Any questions so far? Feel free to make this interactive. If you have questions as we go, happy to hear them, because I'm sure you want to hear other voices other than mine. No, thank you for the courtesy laugh. All right, moving right along. So accountability is basically making sure you know who's there and what people are doing. So one of the problems we had in New York is people were told to stage. So imagine if you have 200 fire trucks showing up, where do you put them? That's obviously a bit of a problem because fire trucks are big, especially in the States. So people were told to stage in certain areas, but they didn't. They went to different places, and that made it problematic tracking who was actually arriving and who was there. And when you don't know who's on your scene or who's available, and if people are there and you think people are there, but you're not sure, then you end up calling for more units because you don't think you've got the right number of people, which meant firehouses had less people to respond to the other things that were going on in the city because, of course, New York doesn't stop. Even with something like 9/11 happening, there were still fires, there were accidents. The fire department was still very busy that day. Although, interestingly enough, people actually called in, were very apologetic for calling 911 that afternoon because they knew they were busy. So that's actually kind of nice. So yeah, as I just mentioned, so a lot of units went to the World Trade Center that wouldn't necessarily have had to go, so that depleted resources in other needed areas, putting the local population in harm's way. And the other problem we had is the incident command post, as we mentioned, it was part of the collapse. All of the records for who was on scene, all of the fancy command boards where they track all of that, was now buried in thousands of tons of rubble. So the one source that they had to track everybody, nowadays it's easy. It's all computer run. You have a mobile dispatch terminal on your fire truck. When you respond, you hit a button and boom, computers know where you are. They already know your staffing. It's all done. Your accountability is taken care of. You've got GPS tracking. So there's even newer models that you don't even have to put a button. It's like they push the button. They say that, oh, you've left the station. We're marking you as responding. So you don't even have to talk on the radio anymore. Much easier. Back then, you had to talk on the radio, and of course it was only single channel, and it was very complicated. So imagine you've got now a situation, you've got 2 towers that have gone down, and you don't even know who's there. Bit of a problem situation for New York. And so when people were managing the things, it was very chaotic and ad hoc. So just basically, oh, you outrank me? What do you want me to do? There was no coherent plan and how they were moving forward. The day started with one, but due to events and the unforeseen collapse of the towers, nobody knew what was going on or really how to control or manage an incident. Again, something we've kind of seen in our industry as well. So the chain of command is the other part, is who do you actually report to? So the first question in a breach at your organizations, do you know who is actually in charge? At my bank, the management team look to me as their CISO. They say, okay, you're in charge. And I respond, no, I shouldn't be. Like, do I have the authority at the bank to shut down our trading floor if we have, say a significant situation where we could say we might exfiltrate 200 to 300 million euros of money that day because of nefarious things that are going on? Sure, I can shut down our trading floors. Would I have a job the next day? Probably not. So those are very senior business decisions that I have no basis doing. My job is ultimately to steer and manage an incident, but we'll talk about that again in a second. So, people had conflicting instructions. As you're going to get in these complicated things, there's a lot of chaos going on between the noise, the collapses, the broken communications. It was, if you pardon the expression, it was a shit show. It was not loss of life notwithstanding, it was not a good day. People were told you had multiple units doing the same thing. You had things that needed to get done that weren't being assigned, which of course now puts more risk to the firefighters because you're putting more firefighters in harm's way, and you're not getting the firefighter and life-saving resources where they're all needed to help do civilian rescues. So again, putting people in a bad thing. Here, I've largely talked about what we have going on, so we can skip that slide. Mutual aid. Mutual aid is basically the engagement of other departments. Now, FDNY is one of the largest, or I think it is the largest fire department in the United States. The thought that FDNY would need to call on surrounding jurisdictions for bodies and tools and fire trucks never really occurred to them. So they didn't have, it never happened. So they didn't have a process to even determine what situations need to happen where we need mutual aid. How do we need who are we going to call? How are we going to do it? They didn't even have a means to call people. They don't know who to call. And there's a typo, interesting. And once they were called, how do you integrate the people into the local operations? These guys, they don't know your language. They don't know your 10 codes. They have different staffing. What could be a heavy rescue in one jurisdiction might not be a heavy rescue in another. People have different definitions for things. So these are some of the common problems that happened. And when people were calling requests, it was unclear because of these problems. And the other thing they had is they didn't even know what the surrounding jurisdictions could offer. So also problematic. Hey, we need more tankers because, we don't have an underground water supply anymore. Where do we get them? These were problems that folks had to solve on the ground. So not a good day for the fire department in New York for a lot of things. But let's try and move things a little lighter. Let's talk about where things started going a little bit better. In Arlington County, Virginia, which is home to the Pentagon. Arlington, as a bit of background, is the smallest county in the United States. It's only 26 square miles, or for those of you that like metric, 67 square whatever a is. Their entire department consisted at the time of 292 firefighters. So if we look at the New York response, literally almost 10 times as many people responded in New York as they were on duty or could be on duty in Arlington. They only had 10 stations that are staffed 24/7 with 13 paramedics. And in 2001, the Council of Governance, I apologize for the acronyms, but just keeping, I believe in less text and more pictures. The Council of Governance, which is basically the group that managed the local counties, they decided to adopt the NIMS ICS model, which is the National Incident Management System, Incident Command Structure. So remember I showed that long list of all the crap I've been trained in? That's what this is. In fact, after 9/11, it became a federal requirement for any department that wanted federal funding that all of their personnel had to be trained in a standard incident management framework, which in this case is ICS. So in Northern Virginia, about 6 months before, they decided to adopt a standardized framework on how to respond. And it wasn't just in Arlington. It was the neighboring counties. It was Alexandria. It was Loudoun County, where I was a firefighter. It was Fairfax County, Stafford County, and Prince William County. So we're otherwise known as the NOVA COG. So if I talk about NOVA region, I mean those 5 counties. And I am going to talk about NOVA region. So, I'll buy a beer for anybody who remembers the name of all the counties. So this was very relevant because at the 9/11 response at the Pentagon, and challenging, I can't give you exact numbers here, and we'll explain why in a second. There were thousands of people there. So it was a big deal. Happily, most of those people who showed up had a standardized way of working. So some of the things that went well and went bad. We had a lot of these you'll see as a common theme. And again, common to our own world in cybersecurity. So self-dispatching. This was a big problem at the Pentagon. In the Northern Virginia region, there were tons of volunteer firefighters, myself being one of them, who decided to throw their gear in their back of their pickup trucks and head to the Pentagon because they wanted to help. Of course, when they get there, they've got the gear, but they don't have breathing apparatus. They don't have any tools, and nobody knows who they are, what their capabilities, what they can do, what they can't do, what they're trained in, what they're good at, what they're bad at. They're just somebody with a fireman's hat, and they showed up to help. And at that point, the first couple of days, sure, come on in and help. because, they needed it. It got a little more structured, which also became a bit of a problem later. The incident commander, James Schwartz, he ended up installing a fence around the Pentagon to stop this from happening. Because this is also the Pentagon. This is the headquarters for the United States military. You need, as a general rule, the minimum of secret level clearance just to get at the facility, to walk in the door. I actually used to work in sub-basement in the North Wing, but that's a story for another time. So they also had a big problem. How do you track who was there? When I said at the beginning, thousands of people showed up. Still today, they don't know who was actually at this response. A bit problematic. Because they're handing out really cool ribbons and awards and stuff, like for, hey, thanks for coming. People got letters from George Bush at the time, which they're actually appreciative of those letters. And no political joke intended. And so that was great, but not everybody who showed up was able to be thanked. Not everybody who showed up was recognized. So still problematic, because there are going to be medical complications as a result of the things that have happened. The byproducts of these accidents, the byproducts of incomplete combustion are highly carcinogenic, and they also do really bad things to your lungs in all sorts of different ways, because there's all sorts of nasty stuff in there. And more firefighters have died since September 11th because of September 11th. But that's a story for the pub, not for here. I'm trying to end on a real positive note, and kind of not happening, right? Don't worry, it gets better. And the other problem with these additional security measures, they actually impacted who was getting there. They ended up instituting badge checks. And of course, the FBI at that point, and he's gone now, they were, taking a little more lead in what was going on. They started saying, well, we should change the badge colors every day, which is problematic when you have people coming in and out literally by the hundreds and in some cases thousands. So people would finish their shifts, would be waiting 3 or 4 hours sometimes for their relief crew to come get them. So people were working extra time in pretty hostile conditions, putting themselves at greater risk of cardiac episodes and things like that, which are actually the number one killer of firefighters in the U.S. Random fact, on average, about 100 firefighters are killed in the line of duty in the U.S. every year. The number's been pretty consistent. More than half of them are for cardiac-related incidents. It's not actually from structural collapse or fire-related things. It's largely because they're out of shape and their heart says, yeah, I'm done. But if you think about it, you go from sound asleep to 3 minutes later, you're going woo down the road full in your gear, to go do your whatever it is you got dispatched to do. It's pretty stressful on the body. I mean, heck, I'm only 24. Sorry, had to go there. Anyway, so going back to command and control, Pentagon presented an interesting situation. Presidential Decision Directive number 39 says the FBI has jurisdiction on all terrorism attacks on U.S. soil. Of course, the attack took place, I see what went on, my picture's over the text. The attack took place at a Department of Defense facility, being the Pentagon, of course, the headquarters, as I mentioned, for the U.S. military. So lots of interesting information there, and a big hole in the building. And, of course, Pentagon Security Forces is a separate group that works for the Department of Defense. Their job is to secure the perimeter of the Pentagon, make sure people go in and out. As we mentioned, the FBI had jurisdiction, so a bit problematic. However, everybody played nice together. So because of the integration of the incident command framework that we talked about, ICS, which we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end, the folks there actually had good relationships. They knew each other. People knew who to talk to, and it went well. So that was a nice thing. The fire service stayed in charge while it was a fire suppression activity, and then the FBI took over when it became a crime scene investigation. And the chain of the command was smooth and very well defined, and had actually largely been agreed on before this happened. Communications here was also a bit of an interesting problem. By the way, for those of you that are history buffs, and I doubt, does anybody here in this room know what this is? I wouldn't expect you to, but I thought it's worth asking. This is what's called a minuter. This is what you would wear if you were a volunteer firefighter or an off-duty firefighter. It's kind of like a pager. It would make a really annoying beep, but only for certain units and for certain stations. So it was actually mapped to your individual firehouse. So if your fire station was dispatched on something, because back in those days, not all the stations had 24-hour staffing. A lot of times, the firefighters, or at least in the volunteer districts, would sleep at home because they weren't running calls every night. They weren't super busy. So they carried something like this. It would buzz. And then they would hear the dispatch radio announcement. They would go to the firehouse and they would know what piece of equipment they needed, and they'd know where to go. Really cool little bit of fire history there that Actually, I've broken several of those. Firefighters break things. So part of the radio issues, of course, for the Pentagon, it's a secure facility. Radio waves are by design not supposed to be going places. So you really had to rely on basically line-of-sight communications on your radios. And even then, it didn't work very well. So that was fairly problematic. So they decided, well, let's use cell phones. Of course, at a big incident like that, the cell phone towers get saturated. Since 9/11, they actually have priority numbers, and every member of a critical infrastructure team has a little card. I actually had one in my wallet with a special number to dial and all that kind of stuff. That's a priority number, so you can actually use a mobile communication system when they're saturated if there's a large-scale event of some kind going on. So, but cell phones were working. Pagers actually worked really well, but not everybody had pagers. So, a bit problematic here again. The communications, as a recurring theme, not a good thing. The other thing that went wrong at the Pentagon was the lack of a joint information center. As a rule of thumb, when you're doing a joint command with interagencies, you end up having an information center whose job it is to talk to the media. Because the Pentagon would have normally been staffed with several thousand people on the west side, and they were expecting several thousand casualties, and that was what was being reported in the media. It was less than 200, fortunately, but so there was a lot of misinformation going out there, which was, of course, causing additional panic and drama with civilians, and that's just not a good thing. You always want to control your message. And yeah, talked about that. And the other problem we have the Pentagon, one of the normal things you do in the fire service is you get to know your response area. For example, if you've got a shopping center, you know what all the entrance points are, you know what to call them, you know where to plug your fire truck in to get water or to push water, you know where to get it, you know where to connect you do what's called pre-planning. Of course, at the Pentagon, they're not really inviting the fire department around to go and do all that kind of stuff. They do now, but they didn't then. So this was also a bit of a problem for obvious reasons. Questions where we are so far? All right, still with us? You want to go to the pub? Oh, I do see a hand.
I was just going to ask who had overall command. Was it actually the FBI then? Because I know that here, any major incidents, police have overall command. Although, for example, fire and rescue will take, obviously, control of situations where fire suppression and rescue are the major things to take all of that time. However, they will still report to the chief police officer that's got commander there.
Yeah.
Was that also the case?
No, it wasn't. So the question for those that didn't hear it, apologize for the oversimplification, was ultimately who actually ran the incident, because over here it's a little different in how it played out. The incident commander for the first few days while they were doing fire suppression was Arlington County Fire Department Assistant Chief Schwartz. He was the formal incident commander for the large majority of the incident. There was an FBI agent whose name I don't remember, who was actually working side by side with him as a primary liaison. But overall, the fire service, while there was still fire to be put out and rescue activities to perform, the fire department was in charge. Once the fire risk was taken care of, the risk of structural collapse, in fact, they called the evacuation tones 4 times, which is frustrating for the firefighter. You make progress putting the fire out, then you have to evacuate. And then the fire goes back where you were, and wow, we just worked for 4 or 5 hours for nothing. You go back and forth. But the FBI took over once the fire element was out. Anything else? And while I need to speed up. Sorry. So, decontamination is a bit of an issue at first because you've got all of the bad stuff in the air, and when you're dealing with a lot of unburned jet fuel, which is also toxic, you had to decontaminate your firefighters, and when you have a lot of firefighters there's a lot of infrastructure needed in an event. I've got a really cool picture towards the end that actually shows the setup they use at the Pentagon for the infrastructure. Batteries. You don't think much about batteries. You typically have a box light on your fire truck for each firefighter. That light lasts about 6 hours, which is great for even advanced operations. Now, at the Pentagon, of course, there's no lighting because the power is out for obvious reasons. They needed batteries. In fact, they called the local Home Depot, which is the equivalent of, what's the hardware store here again? It's orange. Yeah, thank you. That one. They called about 10 minutes to 10 p.m. Yeah, they actually open at useful times over there, which is helpful. I live in Belgium. Stuff closes at 5 and 6. It's frustrating. But so they called them, and about an hour later, a truck with every battery in the shop showed up. So It's kind of cool to see the community come. So, but logistics is a huge problem in large-scale events. Air supply is also a bit of a problem. And I don't mean the great 80s band. I put this up here to make sure you're all awake. You know, I'm all out of love, and so are my bad jokes. But moving back along, air supply was an issue because when you have that many firefighters doing fire suppression activities and you're on your breathing apparatus, you typically get, depending on your fitness levels and activity levels, 30 to 60 minute use. And when you're talking several hundred people doing operations on the ground at any given time, you need quite a bit of infrastructure to refill those cylinders. To complicate matters, not everybody in the Northern Virginia district used the same brand of cylinders. So some people had a company called MSA, and other companies used Draeger, which is a German company. A lot of folks use Scott, and so that added to the complications again. Still going back to air supply. The badging, we talked about how do you actually identify the people that are coming in and out. That was also problematic there. Nowadays, it's simple. You get a badge that has a little two-dimensional barcode with your nationally accredited records and certifications on there. So you can show up at a scene, they can scan it with a certain kind of reader, and they know, oh, you're trained in hazardous materials, you're trained in technical rescue, you can drive fire trucks, aerials, well, all of these things, or you can't do any of these things. Now there's a standardized approach in Northern Virginia that's actually all on everybody's ID card. So that's actually really helpful, especially when you're doing mutual aid in complex situations. On a little fun story, this is a story, one of the problems with the Pentagon is one of the main access routes had a stone footbridge, and that footbridge was low. And in the fire service, if you've got big fire, you want big water. So that's where you use typically a tiller truck or a ladder truck. And do you guys know what tiller trucks are? I didn't think so, so here's a picture of one. This is the one, it's the classic fire truck you see with the driver in the back. We good? You guys? So pretty tall, you've got somebody who steers at the back and, the big rig at the front. So these guys, it's a small volunteer fire company. This little fire truck picture here, it's a 1955 B85 Mack tiller truck. Unless you're a nerd, you won't know anything about that, but it's really cool. It's an old vintage piece, but the cool thing about it is called an open cab fire truck. They're not allowed anymore because of health and safety regulations, but bottom line is all that top stuff wasn't there. And it's because it's older and fire trucks have gotten in the U.S. much bigger. This fire truck, somebody knew about it and they called for it. And these guys got dispatched, drove all the way to the Pentagon, going about 65 miles an hour, because that's as fast as the truck would go downhill with a good wind. And it went under the bridge, and they were able to flow about 900 gallons of water per minute. So multiply that by 4, roughly, for liters per minute. And so that helped until Arlington decided to cut the cab tops off of their tiller truck and then brought it in, because that one could do about 2,000 gallons of water per minute. So they got very creative in how they solved some of their logistics. A big rotary K-12 saw, a little bit of willpower. By the way, those fire trucks cost almost $1 million. I would have loved to be the guy in the saw, I gotta admit. So anytime you're dealing with extended operation support, you need toilet facilities, the canteen I mentioned. All of these things are problematic and also relevant in large investigations and cyber incidents in our own organizations. You can't always get pizza delivered at 2 o'clock in the morning. And heck, in the part of the world I live in, nothing's open at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's not even open on Saturday. I mean, not even churches are open on Sunday in Belgium. It's, sorry, bad joke again. Mutual aid. As I mentioned, we had the COG agreement in place, so all the fire departments, we had standardized playbooks, which we'll come to in a second. There was already an exercise planned for the Pentagon, so there was a lot of homework already done on how to respond to a big event at the Pentagon. So Arlington County, Alexandria County knew how to make stuff work. They have standardized response playbooks, and I'll show you an example of that in just a second. Also have standard communication protocols. Each county is assigned with a number. My county was number 6, so our fire trucks had 6. I was at Fire Station 11. It said 611 on our fire truck. Our radio channel was 6. Really, you got to keep it simple for firefighters. And it worked. So we all know how to talk to each other. We knew if we talked, if engine 514 called, we knew they were from Prince William County. It's a really easy way of knowing who they are. And we had standard builds in terms of what all of our units were. Also back to this, one of the other things that was really cool is all the supporting jurisdictions in the area, basically called Arlington. Hey, whatever you need, just say the word. We'll have it on standby. The thing I love about the fire service is that it is truly a family that help each other, and it's one of the things I miss. So, moving on to things, let's lighten it up a little bit, and let's talk on how to have our own incident responses in our own worlds, take some of the lessons from September 11th, and actually get some benefit from the things that went horribly wrong, but also the things that went well. So the first one we need to look at, of course, is command and control. We're going to talk about communications and training and the exercises associated with this. All of these after-action reports identified about half a dozen elements, and they were all common themes, but I think the three most important ones are these three. So command and control. In Northern Virginia, we have a manual that talks about how to do command and control. How many of us where we work have incident response plans and stuff? Come on. Please help me out here. Wake up. Come on. All right. How many of you guys don't have incident response plans where you work? Okay, that should have been the better question. All right, because that means you don't have to most of you don't put your hands up. All right, so I'm happy with that. Do your incident command modules have a detailed, basically process and procedure on how to manage an incident? So we do. And I'll show you what it looks like. But the first problem is who's in charge. As I mentioned, it shouldn't be the CISO. In my opinion, we shouldn't be in charge. I'll talk about where we should be in just a second. At my old bank where I was working in the U.S., our general counsel for significant events, they were in charge. Because at some point you want the lawyers making the big decisions. Span of control. You don't want more than 5 to 7 people reporting to you at any given time on a crisis situation because it's hard to manage resources more than that. There have been lots of workplace studies. 5 to 7 is ideal. For those of you that have more than that reporting to you at work, you have my sympathies. I've got the same problem. Chain of command is also a bit of an issue, and that's really whose instructions do you actually follow? If there's a cyber breach at your organization, who is actually the person you should be listening to? If you're running the SOC or if you're running the team that are doing the forensics, who is the one person that should be telling you what you need to do next? Is that clearly defined? These are things that you really need to address. And so the other considerations with that, you want to have a general crisis management framework in your organization. The U.S.'s National Incident Management System is, I think, a very good crisis management framework. Here in the UK and across Europe, we do gold, silver, bronze, 3-tiered things, which are great for what levels, but they don't actually go to the granularity on an incident to actually how to tactically manage things in a broad way. They're more operations geared and definitely more for law enforcement, and it's not a good generic framework. And this is just my own opinion here. Those of you that have been involved in those things or use them, I mean no offense. But a generic framework is important because you can activate the pieces you need, and don't activate the pieces you don't. So it needs to be very modular. And more importantly, you need to have a list of well-defined roles. You need to plan ahead. What are all the functions that we are going to need in a worst case of event? How do we define those roles? How do we identify who's going to be in those roles? And then how do we train those people so that when an event happens, they actually know what to do? And I highly recommend that you separate the management from the operations side. Because the last thing your forensics teams need is the CIO, the CISO, the CEO, somebody showing up, hey, how long is this going to take? Because on TV it takes 5 minutes. Some of our queries, of course, take days to run. Like if we have a situation at my bank, it can sometimes take us days to run queries to find out what's the potential impact of certain situations. It's been a tough battle to get management to understand that that's how the real world works. CSI, screw you. You have really ruined it for all of us. It just doesn't help. So this is the National Incident Management generic command structure. This is how they manage all incidents. In the fire service, this is what we use. The FBI, this is what they use. As a bit of history, this command structure was actually developed by California firefighters as a way to manage large area fire responses. And it's now the standard for the U.S. You've really got 4 main branches. First, at the top, you have your incident commander, generic term, but that is the person who's in charge. That doesn't have to be the most senior person, but it has to be a person who's good at coordinating and organizing and managing things. You've got then your public information officer. In our world, this would be your communications department. These are the people that will talk with your social media. These are the people that, basically do your outbound communications. You have somebody who does liaisoning. So if you are getting, like, calling Eamon from Police Scotland to come down and help you out, we want somebody to interface with Police Scotland, or if you've got third-party companies or if a vendor's involved, you need to have a dedicated person or a dedicated team whose sole job is interacting with the other organizations you have there. We, of course, have a safety officer in the fire service because we're firefighters and we do silly things. And I have multiple injuries. I could have shown you those pictures from stuff I've done on duty that's really stupid. Best one, getting carbon monoxide poisoning, wearing a Santa suit on top of the fire truck during a Santa Claus parade. That's why we have safety officers, people like me. But moving right along to the core part, this is split into 4 sections. You have operations. These are basically the people that are putting water on the fire, the ones that are doing the real work. So this would be, in my mind, your SOC manager or whoever's running your security operations. On the planning side of things, that's, I think, where the CISO should go. This is really, what are you doing over the next 12 to 24 hours? What are your next steps? What is it you need to do? Logistics is straightforward. Once you've decided what you need to do, their job is to figure out, how to get you the supplies. If you need more people, if you need more tools, if you need pizza, whatever it is, the job of the logistics branch is to solve that. Now, finance, of course, are the unsung heroes. Let's face it, if you have a significant incident, the purse strings open up and checkbooks are there. Spend what you need. But Lordy, you better be able to defend every pence you spent on the back end. So get the finance people involved right away so you can have that paper trail. Procurement will make exceptions. If you don't have an arrangement with a third party to help you with your breach responses, do it now, because it'll be a lot cheaper if you have a contract signed than the day of. There's a difference between a digit in those daily rates, typically. So at a high level, this is a very generic command structure. Does this make sense for you guys? Pretty clear? I like this. We've actually mapped this at my bank, my old bank. We're currently mapping this right now where I work to do our incident management and incident response. So command and control, they need to be well-defined, but they still need to be generic. You have to train people. I wanted to end on a lighter note, so the pictures are going to be more fun. This was actually a joke picture by, I think, a Norwegian fire department. These train tracks weren't in use, but they're out training. They thought that would be funny. It was, of course, a viral photo, but I just love it. You have to train people. Make sure that the roles that you do are also mapped to how your organization works. You want to have some kind of alignment. Realign your contact information. Make sure that it's verified. There's nothing worse than trying to call people and they don't even work at your institution anymore. Not helpful. So have multiple alternates for all of your roles. And of course, with these structures, you only activate the bits you need. If it's not a big incident, don't activate everybody. Communications, very straightforward. First of all, manage with your expectations with your executive teams. Talk to them about how long investigations take. If it's not TV, that will save you a whole lot of time so that they don't phone you every half an hour looking for updates when you're trying to do your job. Make sure internally you have a formal way of communicating with your executive team and that they know what it is and that they bought off on it. For your external communications, already go through legal and your social media departments and all of that. Have stuff that's pre-approved and have fill-in-the-blank information. So you just put in some values and nobody's arguing about verbiage. In today's social media world, you need to respond quickly and you need to respond accurately. Remember the Tesco breach from about a year and a half ago? It hit the news on a Saturday. It was gone on a Tuesday. They managed it well. Then, of course, there's talk. Exactly. So we've talked social media expectations. We've talked about that. But make sure you've got people who are going to communicate internally and externally and that the corresponding partners know who they are. And also, within your own institutions, have a redundant communication means. Because it could be your network is down, and if you've got voice over IP phones, that's problematic. If the bad guys are in your network and you're managing your call on with a VoIP phone, that could also be problematic depending on how skilled they are. So have good, redundant, out-of-band means of communication. And also have multiple channels for the different functions so you're not oversaturating in one communications mean. Training is straightforward. As I mentioned, try to separate operations from the executive piece, because there's a difference between, standing at the fire SUV and pointing at things and saying, put water there, and actually knowing how to pull your hose off the fire truck and how to operate that effectively. Do tabletop exercises. I highly recommend you do them at least quarterly, because it verifies that your processes work. It also gives confidence to your management team that they know you've got the ball, and more importantly, they know what they need to do as well. And it also is a good opportunity to get more funding for shiny things, typically. And we all like our shiny things. When you do your training, don't insist that everybody's there, because not everybody's going to be there when something really happens. So it's okay if key decision makers aren't there. Make sure you've got some alternates, because that's how it's going to play out in the real world. And also track the lessons learned and have that feedback loop for those improvements. Also, where possible, if you're a large organization, coordinate with HR, so when you're hiring new senior people, you get an opportunity to sit down with them if they've got a role in an incident response of your organization, that they know what that role is, and try to do that right away. It's a great opportunity to meet them, gain some political credibility, and more importantly, it could be helpful when the bad stuff happens. And on your day-to-day activities, try to use the same structures as you would. In the fire department, if we had 3 units, so if we had like an inside gas leak, which gave you 2 engines and a ladder truck, we used the incident command process, and we invoked that structure so that it became second nature to us. We used the same terminology, the same language, and it was a very effective way of doing stuff. And our SOC and our incident management teams and our blue teams are now doing that at our own bank. And we're doing that now to help them get used to the language. That's been very helpful. So the important thing, train the way you play, because there's, different ways of putting out your fires. How much is too much? And I know right now where you're looking at your clocks. In the fire department in Northern Virginia, these are all of the manuals we have. These are all the different playbooks for the different kinds of responses. So as a firefighter, you need to learn your job. As a driver, you need to learn your jobs and all of these. As an officer, you need to learn everybody's job. A lot of stuff to learn. And these playbooks are detailed. With your playbooks, they need to be easy to read. You need to be able to find them. Don't store everything online for obvious reasons, because you want to be able to get at them if stuff goes horribly wrong in your network. And also, they assume that people know how to pull the hose off the fire truck, so you're not saying this is how you work dark trace. You don't want that level of granularity, but you want people to know, do the following things. And again, with your tabletops, review them regularly. You can never train too much. So let's just very quickly, on the command structure, this is the index of the incident command manual. It's got just under 170 pages on how to manage an incident. And it talks about all the roles that are in the incidents. So it's very thorough and very defined. So if you have a playbook on how to manage an incident and it's half a dozen pages, I promise you it's not enough. It's not well thought out. It would be well intended, but it won't be very effective. So that's what it looks like on how to manage an incident. For operations, this is a sample from one of ours in terms of, it's, about 70, 80 pages. And that's for a specific type of fire, which are the mid-rise building fires, which are buildings between 6 and 10 stories. So there's a lot of information, and that's how to put out a fire in that kind of building. So let's recap. What are the key things we've learned? In command and control, we want to define who's in charge, understand your chain of command, make sure you have well-defined roles, and don't have a span of control that's too crazy. You don't want too many people reporting to you. Communications, use the same language, use normal English wherever possible, avoid geek speak, don't use lead speak, because nobody wants that anyway. That's like 1990s, stop it. But use normal English language, because you'll be interfacing with third-party agencies, vendors, and they might not know your acronyms, or they're not going to. So try to be very common and practice everything you do as often as you can. Because in the fire department, you don't just practice pulling your hose off once. If you're not busy that day, you're pulling hose, you're throwing ladders. And in our world, we need to be doing the same thing every day. So that is the picture that I had promised of this was the logistics setup in the parking lot at the Pentagon. A lot of stuff going on. It has showers, canteens, dining halls, lots of toilets, all sorts of things, because there are literally a couple thousand people there every day. So that is how to run a large, complicated incident, which I think is really cool. Are there any questions? As a point of information, just before that fire was taken, I was, here. It was a great day. We got 11 saves, 1 goldfish, and 2 cats. I care more about the cats. I'm sure the goldfish was happy. People, you can always make more babies. But anyway, questions? Sorry, we're totally running late. Yes? That is always the tricky part. The best thing you can do is if you can try to find an executive sponsor and win somebody, a senior person on the business side in your organization, and get them and just target on them. Because in most organizations, generally, somebody who kind of gets it, get them to send out the invites. The most senior the person that sends out the invites, that's where you get your people. If you're just coming out from like, I'm a fairly senior person in my own organization, if I send them out, people aren't going to show up. But if our CEO sends them out, people show up. So you have to be very strategic in building those key relationships. Try to find a stakeholder that doesn't have the word security in the title. In fact, don't ever use that word. It's a bad word. Stop it. It doesn't help. Talk about value, talk about risk, stop saying security. But that's the only generic advice I can give. We can talk after, get a little more granular information on your organization and help you a little bit more that way. Yes, sir. Right. So to make sure I could hear you, I think the question was, should we have playbooks for things like DDoS, as malware? Yeah, short answer is absolutely. With all of these things, there are standard repeatable tasks that you'll do to manage a DDoS attack or a malware infection or a phishing incident or some other indicator of compromise. There are things that are pretty standard, so those you should document and make repeatable and make sure you know who's doing what. Because part of the problem is, okay, well, we've got this. Okay, now what do we do? So it's great to open up a little binder, flip through pages, and let's do this, unless the situation warrants something different. In the playbooks I showed, as the first arriving officer, you have the right to change what's going on because you've got eyes on scene, and you can say, okay, we're not doing the normal play, we're going to do A, B, and C. You get on the radio and you communicate it. You do the same thing in our own world as well. I see you in the corner of my eye, Rory, but I'm still asking for more questions. Anyone else? Okay, we had one last one.
When you have an incident, tempted to just bring everyone in. Everyone in on the board at work, and that's great for the first 12 hours, but then everyone burns out.
Right.
And that's fine for firearms, because they would like to do green paper and like to take over. But in an office, you don't have a full-time night team. But if an incident happens, you're going to need that. So how do you decide who's going to have to do the night, who's going to have to do the day, 3 or 4 days it's going to take to resolve?
The simplest way to answer that, so the question is, if you're a small organization, who's going to do the night work? You don't have all those resources that run people 24/7. I'll just summarize, and then for the sake of the recording as well. Is that a fair summary of your question? Yeah. Okay. So the simple answer, you're going to need external parties. There's no way you can do it yourself. There's no harm in basically putting a standby agreement with a third-party firm saying, if we need you, this is what it's going to cost. This is what we're going to do. I do recommend if you do use third parties, have them come when you do your training exercises so they're familiar with your organization a little bit as well. You'll, of course, have to pay their consulting rates for that. But really, you can't do it yourself if you're a small team. Because to your point, burnout, it's brutal. And your team's going to be there anyway because that's just how people are. So make sure you have some food on hand, and don't do it in Belgium. I'm not biased against Belgium. It's a nice place. Rory.
Yes.
You have things to say.
Yep. We are unfortunately out of time.
Sorry.
So first off.
And I thought I was going to be done quick.
Yeah. Huge thank you to Chris first, please.